A couple weeks ago, one of the 10 new movies we're actually getting this year was released, a movie that I was very curious about from the first time I heard about it. For one, I like a good gangster movie, and seeing Tom Hardy play Al Capone just feels right. Also, it wasn't going to be a traditional biopic, but would instead cover the part of Al Capone's life that doesn't get much discussion after his release from prison and being crippled by disease. Overall, I was really intrigued by this movie, and seeing Josh Trank coming back after the whole Fantastic Four disaster back in 2015 made me even more intrigued. Trank spent a lot of time planning this movie, originally titled Fonzo, and faced a lot of roadblocks along the way. In the end, it didn't even get its theatrical release, but it still managed to see the light of day, and the reaction was mostly, mixed. It's been mixed. By now, you've probably heard some talk about how this movie is the one where Tom Hardy poops his pants a lot, and that's unfortunately become a bit of a reductive, critical catchphrase for it. People seem to be writing this movie off in droves, and it's definitely not a traditional biopic, but that fact is actually what made me really enjoy and respect this movie. I can't disagree that it's off-putting. This isn't a movie I'd want to watch with my parents on Christmas Eve or anything, but the purpose and impact of its approach really fascinated me. And just a warning, I'm going to be talking very in-depth about this movie, so if you haven't seen Capone yet, please watch it first. It's worth watching even if you hate it. I want to start with the idea of what biopics represent. As a genre, they have limitless story potential because every person's life plays out in radically different ways. And as a culture obsessed with celebrity and iconography, we are inevitably drawn to these stories. I mean, just look at the deluge of prestigious biopics we get every year around Oscar season. There's definitely a recognizable model to the genre at this point, and what people usually come to these films looking for is, in a general sense, answers. We want insights, we want revelations, we want to feel like we understand the person behind the famous name, image, or actions more deeply. Like that insane twist in Rocketman where it turns out Elton John is actually gay, and if you look at the trailer for Capone, it's setting up the kinds of questions that usually drive biopics.
He has full-blown dementia.
I have reason to believe it could all be an elaborate act.
We have information that your client may have tucked away a very large sum of money.
Where's the 10 million? Is Capone faking his condition? Who can he trust? And the answers to those questions are all in the movie, even if they are intentionally unsatisfying. But more importantly, they all link back to the recurring theme of what makes someone a legend. Capone as a movie is not the story of Al Capone. It's not the story of how he died. It's not even the story of the $10 million he allegedly hid. It's about the image that pops into your head when you hear the name Al Capone and how reality reflects that image. Biopics often give their audience a very dramatized, aggrandized vision of a person, and they can make their subjects feel more than human at times by embracing the iconography that defined them. Capone, on the other hand, actively rejects any form of aggrandizing. This movie doesn't exist to show how cool Al Capone was and how he had a super secret plan to fool the FBI because he's the best gangster ever, and then he kisses all the girls. The fact is, Al Capone was crippled by neurosyphilis and dementia, and Trank is more concerned with what that would look and feel like. This Al Capone is rarely given any dignity and never given any sense of real strength. He's more like a decapitated figurehead, living out his final days in his enormous house. That house is surrounded by statues of iconic historical and mythological figures, their legacies preserved and appreciated as works of art. Not unlike how a biopic can preserve an image of a person in our collective memory as something elevated or as something to be appreciated. Which is where Tom Hardy's wonderful performance comes in, and it may not be what the Oscars go for, but I think it's pretty incredible to watch. I mean, if you tell Tom Hardy to act like an insane person, this is what you should expect. But the insanity and chaos behind that performance, the kind this whole movie revels in, is the reason why it works so well. There's no dignity, there's no power. Capone never really does anything in this movie. The only things he explicitly does outside of his own head are sing along to the Wizard of Oz and shoot one of his laborers in the knee. We only get a glimpse at the quote-unquote real Al Capone at the beginning of the movie, where he has the presence and confidence that you might expect. But that only really serves to show the cracks in the armor of his legend, and not too long later he's treated no differently than a confused old man.
Sit down. Honey, sit down.
The only time we see Al Capone looking like the fully traditional image of Al Capone is in one of his twisted nightmares, and it could not be more on the nose that this image is only seen as a reflection. Capone can't trust his own perspective, the things he's told by other characters get twisted and warped in his head, and the audience slowly learns that they can't trust him either. A lot of characters, scenes, and images in this movie exist purely as imagination or metaphor, and if they're not explicitly stated as such, they could be real or not real. Normally, I'm not a huge fan of the whole you never know what's real approach to filmmaking, but the way this movie embraces that ambiguity just fits so well. And to me, the reason why is because it directly contradicts that idea of truth and answers that we expect from biopics. Josh Trank employs so many genre, narrative, and aesthetic tricks to keep you thinking that you're watching a regular biopic and then keeps pulling that rug out from under you. He wants to disorient and confuse the audience, but it's in service of keeping you on the same level as the protagonist and making you question the same things Capone himself would have to question. And eventually, it starts to not matter what's real, but instead what Capone believes and what the characters around him believe. And when you think about it, isn't that what biopics help to create? Not the truth about a person, but a mutually accepted truth? It all ties back to the idea of legacy. To me, the biggest question to the audience is, how did we all view Al Capone before this movie came out, and how has that image changed? Because to me, the change is irreversible. The cinematic legacy of Al Capone is even somewhat referenced in this movie, in the scenes where Capone listens to the radio drama recalling his exploits.
Al Capone sends his regards.
Through all forms of media, we build people like Al Capone up into these mythical figures, these supervillains. And Capone the movie, in many ways, is a refutation of that legacy. It does everything in its power to strip away that dignity and presence, even by literally stripping away the gangster iconography from Capone. And when we see him rampaging around his mansion, shooting a golden Tommy gun, we're not supposed to be afraid of him, because in spite of everything he did, everything he inspired, this is still what he was reduced to. That sequence ends up being a hallucination, but the message is even more clear because of it. That power and rage he embodied is a fantasy now, and it's only as real as we let it be. Ultimately, the legacy of Al Capone is what we let it be, and what we choose to believe about him shapes how he'll be remembered as time goes on. And more often than not, the cinematic versions of iconic people that we see are shaped by a story that's trying to bring in the biggest audience possible, so things get sensationalized or sanitized. And then you have Capone, this fascinating little movie that may be among the most unmarketable biopics of all time, but achieves so much more than other movies in that genre. And all those mysteries the trailer was setting up didn't even matter, because this movie did more than recreate history. It made new history for Capone as a character. So maybe you threw on Capone and you saw Tom Hardy acting all crazy, and there were all these ambiguous answers to the questions the story raised, and you assumed that Josh Trank was some pretentious dick. And maybe you're right, but he's also contributed a perspective to the legacy of Al Capone that makes it far more nuanced, even if this movie can rarely be called subtle. And in a long line of biopics, I'd take that over another movie about how some rock band did a lot of drugs but were still good people. Maybe this movie didn't tell a traditional story, but there was a fascinating story to tell, and I'm glad Josh Trank got the chance to tell it. Not only because he's had more than a little familiarity with seeing a certain image of himself in the press and in collective opinion, but also because he told this story in a way that feels truly like his own. So, is Capone a masterpiece? No. Is it a game changer? Probably not. Will it gain a cult following and allow dozens of film students to tell their Tinder dates that they just don't get it? Almost definitely. Above all else, I'm just glad this movie gave me something to think about beyond Al Capone was cool, and I feel like this project would have been more along those thematic lines if someone else had made it, but nobody else did make it, and for better or worse, this is Capone. I'm a fan, and even though I'm sure it'll be up for some Razzies when that dreaded time rolls around, if you give this movie a shot, it might surprise you. So, those are my thoughts on Capone, and hopefully I've convinced you to check it out if you haven't already. I'm assuming there are more than a few people who watched this video without even watching the movie, because I do that all the time, so no judgment. Thanks very much for watching this video. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, feel free to leave a like and subscribe for more. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.